What happens when Britain's most beloved actress walks onto a television set expecting a friendly conversation, only to find herself trapped in the most vicious ambush of her legendary career? In exactly 38 seconds, one calculated question from Piers Morgan would shatter decades of mutual respect and ignite a confrontation so explosive that it would end with Dame Judi Dench, a woman known for her grace and composure, doing something she had never done in 60 years of public appearances, walking off a live television set in the middle of an interview. This is the story of how a morning chat show became a battleground, how professional courtesy collapsed into personal warfare, and why the footage of what happened that day would be watched over 50 million times within 48 hours, becoming the most viral moment in British television history. Before we see how this confrontation escalates to its shocking conclusion, do yourself a favor and hit that subscribe button for modern stories, because what unfolds over the next 45 minutes will leave you absolutely speechless. And trust me, you're going to want to come back for more stories like this. The Good Morning Britain studios on that particular Thursday morning in March 2025 felt different from the moment Dame Judi Dench arrived. There was an electricity in the air that the veteran crew members couldn't quite put their finger on. A tension that seemed out of place given that the scheduled guest was one of the most universally adored figures in British entertainment. At 90 years old, Dame Judi had agreed to appear on the program to discuss her latest project, a documentary about the importance of theatre education in schools, a cause she had championed for decades. The booking had been made weeks in advance through her publicist, and the agreed-upon topics had been clearly outlined. Her work with young actors, the state of British theatre, her memories of some of her most iconic roles, and her views on keeping the arts alive in an increasingly digital world. What nobody had told Dame Judi, what her team had not been informed of, what the junior producers themselves didn't know until that very morning, was that Piers Morgan had other plans entirely. He had spent the previous evening researching, preparing, building what he would later describe to colleagues as his most important interview in years, though the rest of the world would come to see it very differently. Dame Judi arrived at the studio at precisely 7:15 a.m., punctual as always, dressed impeccably in an elegant navy blue suit that spoke to her classic sense of style. She greeted every crew member she passed with genuine warmth, remembered the name of a camera operator she had worked with years ago on a different project, and even brought homemade biscuits for the green room staff. A gesture so typically thoughtful that it had several people commenting on how lucky they were to have her on the show. In the makeup room, she chatted easily with the artist working on her face, discussing everything from the weather to the latest West End productions. Her laughter genuine and frequent, putting everyone around her at ease. This was Dame Judi in her element, comfortable, kind, the epitome of grace that had made her a national treasure. Meanwhile, in his dressing room 3 doors down, Piers Morgan sat reviewing his notes with an intensity that concerned even his most loyal production assistants. He had circled certain questions in red pen, underlined others, made margin notes that read, "Push harder here and don't let her deflect." Behavioral patterns that anyone who had worked with him recognized as signs he was preparing for. Confrontation rather than conversation. Susanna Reed arrived at the studio about 20 minutes before they were due to go live, and the moment she saw the running order for Dame Judi's segment, her face went pale. She immediately went to find the senior producer, her heels clicking rapidly on the corridor floor as she moved with obvious urgency. "This isn't what was agreed," she said, her voice tight with concern as she held up the papers. Dame Judi's team confirmed topics about theatre education and her career. "There's nothing here about any of this." The producer, a man who had learned over the years that arguing with Piers rarely ended well, simply shrugged with obvious discomfort. "Piers changed it last night," he said quietly. Said he wanted to make it more relevant, more newsworthy. "I tried to push back, but you know how he gets." Susanna's expression hardened. "Does Dame Judi know? Does her publicist know?" The producer's silence was answer enough. Susanna closed her eyes briefly, seeming to steel herself for what was coming. "This is going to be a disaster," she said softly. "An absolute disaster." At 8:47 a.m., Dame Judi was escorted onto the set, her smile warm as she waved to the small studio audience that had gathered to watch the live broadcast. Piers stood to greet her, all charm and smiles, taking her hand in both of his with an enthusiasm that might have seemed genuine to anyone who didn't know what was coming. "Dame Judi," he said warmly, "what an absolute honor to have you here. You look wonderful as always." "Thank you, Piers," she replied with that distinctive voice that had commanded stages and screens for 6 decades. "It's lovely to be here, though I must say I'm not at my best this early in the morning." The studio audience laughed, charmed immediately as audiences always were by her self-deprecating wit and natural warmth. She settled into the guest chair, accepted a glass of water from a production assistant, and looked entirely comfortable and unsuspecting as the final countdown to going live began. Susanna Reid took her seat beside Piers, her jaw tight, her usual pre-show smile notably absent, and anyone paying close attention would have seen her glance at Dame Judi with something that looked remarkably like an apology already forming in her eyes. The show's theme music played. The cameras went live, and Piers Morgan launched into his opening with that confident energy he was known for. "Welcome back to Good Morning Britain," he said, his voice carrying across the studio and into millions of homes. "We're absolutely delighted to be joined this morning by the one and only Dame Judi Dench, a true legend of stage and screen. Dame Judi, thank you so much for being here." "The pleasure is mine," Dame Judi responded graciously, clearly expecting the easy conversation she had been promised. They started with safe territory, a brief discussion about her early days in theatre, a funny anecdote about a costume malfunction during a performance of Macbeth that had everyone laughing, some kind words about young actors she had mentored over the years. For the first 6 minutes, everything seemed perfectly normal, perfectly pleasant, exactly what everyone had expected. Dame Judi was relaxed, engaging, generous with her stories and her laughter. Susanna asked thoughtful questions about the documentary project, genuinely interested in Dame Judi's passion for theatre education. The audience was eating it up, captivated by this window into the life and mind of someone they had admired for so long. But then, at exactly 8:54 a.m., Piers shifted in his seat with that deliberate movement that Susanna had learned to dread. And his tone changed completely. "Dame Judi," he said, his voice taking on a sharper edge that immediately altered the atmosphere in the studio. "I want to shift gears a bit, if I may, because there's something I think we need to discuss. Your career has spanned an incredible period of change in our society, and I'm curious to get your perspective on something that's been dominating the cultural conversation. What are your thoughts on the state of modern feminism and whether it's gone too far?" The question landed in the studio like a bomb. Dame Judi's smile faltered slightly, confusion flickering across her face. Susanna's head whipped around to stare at Piers with undisguised shock. Several crew members exchanged worried glances, recognizing immediately that this was nowhere close to the agreed-upon topics. "I'm sorry," Dame Judi said carefully. "I'm not sure I follow. Gone too far in what sense?" Piers leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that was clearly making her uncomfortable. "Well, you've been a successful woman in a male-dominated industry for decades. You did it without complaining, without playing the victim, without demanding special treatment. Don't you think the current generation of actresses and women in general have become rather too focused on grievances rather than simply getting on with the work like you did?" The studio went very quiet. Dame Judi's expression had shifted from confusion to something much more guarded, much more careful. When she spoke, her voice carried a diplomatic caution that hadn't been there moments before. "I think every generation faces different challenges, Piers, and every generation responds to those challenges in the way that feels right to them. I certainly wouldn't presume to tell younger women how they should or shouldn't advocate for themselves." But Piers wasn't backing down. He was just getting started, and anyone watching could see he had come prepared for this specific confrontation. "Come on now," he pressed. That's a very diplomatic answer, but surely you must have some concerns about the victim mentality that seems to pervade modern discourse. The Me Too movement, for instance, don't you think some women have taken it too far? Weaponized accusations, destroyed men's careers over minor infractions or even false claims. Before this gets even more uncomfortable, make sure you've subscribed to Modern Stories because what Dame Judi says next will change the entire tone of this interview. And you absolutely need to see how Piers Morgan reacts. Hit that subscribe button right now, and let's continue with this unbelievable confrontation. Dame Judy's posture had gone rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Susanna tried desperately to intervene, her voice carrying an edge of panic, barely concealed beneath professional composure. Piers, I really don't think this is— No, Susanna. Piers cut her off sharply without even looking at her, his gaze still fixed entirely on Dame Judi. This is important. We have one of the most respected women in British entertainment sitting here. Someone who succeeded through talent and hard work, and I think her perspective on these issues is valuable. Dame Judi, surely you can see the difference between legitimate complaints about workplace behavior and what often looks like attention-seeking or career advancement disguised as activism. The insult implicit in the question, the suggestion that women who spoke out about harassment or abuse were doing so for attention or career benefits, seemed to hit Dame Judi like a physical blow. Her face, which had been carefully neutral, now showed clear anger barely held in check. Piers, she said, her voice quiet but carrying a warning that anyone with sense would have heeded. I came here this morning to discuss theater education. I was told that was the purpose of this interview. I was not told I would be ambushed with loaded questions designed to make me attack other women for having the courage to speak about their experiences. Ambushed, Piers repeated with a laugh that sounded more aggressive than amused. That's rather dramatic, don't you think? I'm simply asking for your honest opinion on cultural issues that affect everyone. Or are you saying you don't have opinions on these matters? Of course I have opinions, Dame Judi replied, her voice rising slightly for the first time. But I question your motives in asking them, and I particularly question your framing of the issues in such a biased and frankly offensive way. Piers's eyebrows shot up in exaggerated surprise. Offensive? How is it offensive to suggest that perhaps not every accusation should be automatically believed, that perhaps we should maintain some standards of evidence before destroying someone's life and career? That seems like basic common sense to me. Dame Judi took a slow breath, clearly trying to maintain her composure. The Me Too movement, she said carefully, gave voice to countless women who had been silenced for decades. Women who had experienced genuine harassment, assault, and abuse in industries including my own. To characterize that entire movement as women weaponizing accusations or seeking attention is not only offensive, it's dangerous. It discourages women from speaking up when they genuinely need to, and it perpetuates exactly the kind of culture that allowed predatory behavior to flourish unchecked for so long. Susanna nodded vigorously, clearly in complete agreement. Dame Judi is absolutely right, Piers. Your characterization of the movement is deeply problematic and— Stay out of this, Susanna, Piers snapped, his mask of civility slipping further. You've made your position on these issues abundantly clear over the years. I'm interested in hearing from someone whose career predates all this modern hysteria. Modern hysteria, Dame Judi repeated, her voice now cold as ice. Is that what you think it is? Women finally having the platform and the support to speak about abuse and harassment, and you dismiss it as hysteria. I'm not dismissing genuine cases, Piers said, though his tone suggested otherwise. I'm questioning whether every single claim deserves to be treated as gospel truth, without any scrutiny whatsoever. I'm questioning whether we've created a culture where men are guilty until proven innocent, where a single accusation can end a career without any due process. Surely you can see the danger in that. Dame Judi leaned forward, her eyes blazing with an intensity that would have been at home in any of her most powerful dramatic roles. Let me tell you what I see as dangerous, Piers. I see the danger in giving powerful men who abuse their positions a free pass, because we're too concerned about the tiny percentage of false accusations. I see the danger in prioritizing the comfort of men who might face awkward questions over the safety of women who are trying to do their jobs without being harassed or assaulted. I see the danger in people like you using your platform to undermine a movement that has genuinely helped people by cherry-picking the most extreme examples and pretending they represent the whole. The studio had gone completely silent except for her voice. Every crew member, every audience member was transfixed by the sight of this normally gracious, gentle woman transformed into someone fierce and uncompromising. Piers, perhaps realizing he had pushed her to a point of no return, but unable or unwilling to back down, doubled down instead. People like me, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You mean people who believe in things like evidence and due process. People who think maybe we should be concerned when lives are destroyed based on accusations that sometimes turn out to be false or exaggerated. Yes, people like you, Dame Judi shot back immediately. People who hide behind concepts like due process and evidence while showing absolutely no concern for the countless women whose lives were destroyed by abuse that went unreported and unpunished because the system was stacked against them, believing or supporting them. You want to talk about destroyed lives, Piers? Let's talk about all the careers that ended, not because of false accusations, but because women were assaulted or harassed, and then forced out of industries when they dared to complain. Let's talk about the suicides, the trauma, the decades of suffering that women endured in silence because they knew that speaking up would mean being dismissed as hysterical or attention-seeking or, how did you put it, weaponizing accusations. Susanna had tears in her eyes now, clearly moved by Dame Judi's passionate defense. The audience, which had been silent in shock, began to applaud, softly at first, but growing in volume and intensity. Piers's face had gone red, a clear sign to anyone who knew him that his temper was rising dangerously. So, what you're saying, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, is that we should just believe all women automatically. No questions asked, no scrutiny allowed? That seems like a recipe for disaster to me. That's not what I'm saying at all, Dame Judi replied, her voice heavy with frustration. What I'm saying is that when women come forward with accusations of harassment or abuse, particularly when those accusations involve powerful men, our first instinct should be to take them seriously, rather than to immediately question their motives or their honesty. That's a very different thing from believing automatically without any investigation. But you seem far more concerned with the theoretical risk of a false accusation than with the very real, very documented reality of widespread abuse that women have faced for decades. Before Piers can fire back with his next attack, quickly subscribe to Modern Stories because this argument is about to reach a boiling point that neither of them can come back from, and you won't believe what Dame Judi Dench does next. Hit subscribe and let's see how this erupts. Piers stood up from his desk abruptly, a move designed to intimidate, to use his physical presence to dominate the space. You want to talk about documented reality? Fine. Let's talk about reality. Let's talk about the men whose careers have been destroyed, whose lives have been ruined, based on accusations that later turned out to be false or grossly exaggerated. Let's talk about the rush to judgment, the trial by social media, the complete absence of anything resembling fair process. Don't those men matter? Don't their lives and their families matter? Or are they just acceptable collateral damage in your crusade? Dame Judi remained seated, but her voice, when she spoke, carried more authority than Piers's bluster could ever achieve. Of course their lives matter, she said, each word precise and deliberate. Every person deserves fairness and justice. But Piers, you're creating a false equivalence. The number of false accusations is statistically tiny compared to the epidemic of genuine abuse that went unreported and unpunished for decades. You're focusing your energy, your platform, your considerable influence on defending the tiny minority of men who might be falsely accused, while showing no comparable concern for the vast majority of women who were genuinely abused and never saw justice. That's not balance. That's bias. Piers slammed his hand on the desk, the sound echoing through the studio and causing several people to jump. Bias? You're accusing me of bias? You're the one who's completely bought into this narrative that all men are potential predators and all women are victims. You're the one who refuses to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, some women lie. Some women exaggerate. Some women use these accusations as weapons against men they don't like, or men who rejected them, or men whose careers they want to damage. Dame Judy's expression had moved beyond anger now into something that looked like profound disappointment. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but devastating in its clarity. Do you know what I find most telling about this conversation, Piers? In all your concerns about false accusations and destroyed careers and men being treated unfairly, not once have you expressed any empathy or concern for the women who were genuinely abused. Not once have you acknowledged their pain or their courage in coming forward, despite knowing they would face exactly this kind of skepticism and hostility. Your entire focus is on defending men from accusations while attacking women for making them. And you claim you're not biased? Susanna seized the moment to try once more to salvage something from this disaster. Dame Judy, perhaps we could return to discussing your documentary about theatre education. I think our viewers would really love to hear more about that important work. But Piers wasn't done. Not nearly done. And what he said next would push the situation past any hope of recovery. Forget the bloody documentary, he snapped at Susanna before turning back to Dame Judy with unconcealed hostility. You want to know why I focus on false accusations? Because everyone else is falling over themselves to believe every word that comes out of an accuser's mouth without any critical thinking whatsoever. Because we've created a culture where being skeptical, we're asking for evidence, we're suggesting that maybe we should verify claims before destroying someone's life. That makes you somehow a villain. Well, I'm sorry, but I refuse to participate in that madness. I refuse to accept that believing women automatically is more important than seeking truth. Dame Judy stood up then, slowly and deliberately, and the movement seemed to command instant attention from everyone in the studio. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of 9 decades of life experience and 6 decades of professional authority. You refuse to participate, she said, each word dropping like a stone into still water. How noble of you, Piers. How brave to use your platform, your power, your considerable privilege to defend powerful men against the inconvenience of being held accountable for their actions. You frame it as seeking truth, as being rationally skeptical, but what you're actually doing is perpetuating the exact same system that has protected abusers for generations. You're making it harder for women to come forward. You're giving cover to genuinely guilty men, and you're doing it all while congratulating yourself on your integrity and your refusal to follow the crowd. The analysis was surgical in its precision and brutal in its accuracy. Piers's mouth opened and closed several times, clearly searching for a response that wouldn't confirm exactly what she had just outlined. Don't you dare, he finally managed, his voice shaking with rage. Don't you dare suggest that I'm protecting abusers. I've never defended anyone who was proven guilty of assault or harassment. Never. But proven guilty is the key phrase there, isn't it? You want proof? You want evidence? You want convictions before you'll believe a woman's account of what happened to her. Dame Judy took a step closer to where he stood. But here's the reality that you seem unwilling or unable to grasp. Most abuse doesn't happen in front of witnesses. Most harassment doesn't leave physical evidence. Most assault can't be proven beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law because it happens behind closed doors, in private spaces, in situations where it's one person's word against another's. So your insistence on proof, on evidence, on conviction before you'll believe an accusation. In practice, what that means is you'll almost never believe women, because the standard you're demanding is one that can rarely be met. And that's not skepticism, Piers. That's just another way of ensuring that powerful men are never held accountable. The studio audience erupted into applause, many people on their feet now, clearly moved by Dame Judy's articulation of something many had felt but struggled to express. Piers looked around at the applauding audience with obvious fury. "Oh, wonderful!" he shouted over the noise. "Standing ovation for mob justice. Standing ovation for guilty, until proven innocent. This is exactly what's wrong with modern society. This mindless acceptance of accusation as fact." Dame Judy shook her head sadly. "You keep using these phrases. Mob justice. Guilty, until proven innocent. As if they're talismans that protect you from having to engage with the actual substance of the issue. But here's what you're missing, Piers. Nobody is saying that accusers should never be questioned, or that evidence doesn't matter, or that people shouldn't have the opportunity to defend themselves. What people are saying is that when women come forward with accusations, particularly accusations against powerful men, they deserve to be taken seriously rather than immediately doubted. They deserve to be treated with respect rather than torn apart in the media. And they deserve to have their claims investigated thoroughly, rather than dismissed because the accused is someone popular, or important, or well-connected." Piers moved around the desk, getting into Dame Judy's personal space in a way that was clearly intended to be intimidating. The camera caught every moment, including the way Dame Judy held her ground without flinching, her eyes never leaving his face. "You think I don't take women seriously?" he said, his voice low and intense. "I take truth seriously. I take justice seriously. I take the principle that an accusation isn't proof seriously. And if that makes me some kind of villain in your eyes, then so be it. I'd rather be a villain who stands for something real than a hero who goes along with mass hysteria just to be popular." "There it is again," Dame Judy said, her voice carrying a note of something almost like pity. "Hysteria. That's what you call it when women speak up. That's what you called it at the beginning of this ambush you disguised as an interview. Women expressing legitimate grievances, women demanding accountability, women refusing to stay silent anymore about abuse and harassment, and you dismiss it all as hysteria. Do you know how revealing that word choice is? Do you know how much it exposes about your actual attitudes toward women and their experiences?" Piers's face was nearly purple now, his composure completely shattered. "My attitudes toward women? I have enormous respect for women. My mother is a woman. I have daughters. I work with women every day. Don't you dare suggest that I'm some kind of misogynist because I believe in standards of evidence." Dame Judy's laugh was bitter and sharp. "Ah, yes, the I have women in my life defense. That's always very convincing, Piers. The fact that you have female relatives doesn't mean you respect women's experiences or perspectives. It doesn't mean you treat women's concerns with the seriousness they deserve. And frankly, the way you've conducted this interview, the way you've tried to trap me into attacking other women, the way you've dismissed an entire movement as hysteria, the way you've shown more concern for hypothetical false accusations than for documented widespread abuse, all of that suggests your respect for women is rather more theoretical than practical." Susanna had given up trying to moderate or redirect. She sat at the desk with her head in her hands, clearly devastated by what was happening to the show she co-hosted. Members of the production team were frantically speaking into headsets, trying to figure out whether to cut to commercial, whether to end the segment early, whether there was any way to salvage this absolute disaster. But the decision was about to be taken out of their hands entirely. Piers pointed his finger directly at Dame Judy's face, a gesture that managed to be both aggressive and childish simultaneously. "You know what your problem is? You've been in your liberal theater bubble for so long, surrounded by people who think exactly like you do, that you've completely lost touch with what normal people think. Normal people are sick of being lectured about privilege and abuse and how terrible men are. Normal people are tired of the victimhood and the constant complaining. Normal people want to see women like you used to be, strong and capable, and getting on with things without whining about how hard it all is." The silence that followed was absolute and profound. Even the camera operators seemed to be holding their breath. Dame Judy looked at Piers for a long moment, her expression cycling through anger, disappointment, and finally settling on something that looked remarkably like contempt. "Strong and capable," she repeated slowly, getting on with things without whining. Is that what you think I was doing all those years, Piers? Just getting on with it? Let me tell you something about what getting on with it actually meant. For women of my generation, it meant staying silent when directors made inappropriate comments about your body. It meant laughing off unwanted touches and advances because complaining would mark you as difficult and end your career. It meant watching men with half your talent get roles you were better suited for because they were men, and you were a woman. It meant being paid less, credited less, respected less, and knowing that speaking up about any of it would accomplish nothing except making you unemployable. That's what getting on with it meant. And you hold that up as some kind of ideal compared to modern women who have the audacity to demand better treatment? Subscribe to Modern Stories right now if you haven't already, because Dame Judi Dench is about to do something that will shock everyone in that studio, including Piers Morgan himself. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the explosive conclusion to this confrontation. Her voice had risen with each word, the passion and anger she had been controlling, finally breaking through completely. Piers tried to interrupt, but she spoke over him, something that clearly shocked him given how rarely anyone dared to do so. No, you wanted this conversation. Now you're going to hear what I have to say. You think women today are weak because they speak up about harassment and abuse? They're not weak, Piers. They're braver than I ever was. They're brave enough to risk their careers, their reputations, their mental health, to speak truth about what they've experienced. They're brave enough to face people like you who will question their motives, doubt their stories, and try to tear them down for daring to name their abusers. They're brave enough to say this is not acceptable. I will not stay silent. I will not protect powerful men at the expense of my own dignity and safety. That's not weakness. That's incredible strength. And the fact that you can't see that, the fact that you interpret their refusal to suffer in silence as victimhood or attention-seeking, that tells me everything I need to know about you. Piers's face had gone from purple to an almost grayish pale, fury, and something that might have been embarrassment fighting for dominance. You're being ridiculous, he said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. I never said women shouldn't report genuine abuse. I said we need to be careful about accepting every accusation without question. That's not the same thing. It never is with you, is it? Dame Judi fired back immediately. You always claim you support women who've been genuinely abused while spending all your energy attacking women who come forward with accusations. You claim you believe in evidence while dismissing women's testimony as inherently unreliable. You claim you're concerned about fairness while showing no comparable concern for the unfairness of a system that has historically protected abusers and punished victims. Your words say one thing, but your actions, your focus, your energy, all of that tells a completely different story. Piers turned away from her, addressing the cameras directly in what appeared to be a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. Ladies and gentlemen, what you're witnessing here is exactly what happens when you question the prevailing narrative. You're attacked, you're called names, your motives are questioned. Dame Judi whirled on him, her voice sharp. Don't you dare play the victim now. Don't you dare act like you're the one being attacked when you're the one who invited me here under false pretenses, ambushed me with controversial topics I was never told we would discuss, and then tried to bully me into saying what you wanted to hear. This entire interview was designed as a trap, and when I refused to spring it, when I refused to attack other women for your entertainment, you've shown your true colors completely. Susanna finally looked up, her voice quiet but firm. Dame Judi is absolutely right, Piers. This was never a fair interview. You had an agenda from the start, and you've treated a legendary actress with appalling disrespect. I'm ashamed to be part of this. Piers whirled on her, his anger finding a new target. You're ashamed? You're the one who's been undermining me throughout this entire interview, making faces, sighing, clearly siding with the guest against your own co-host. If you have such a problem with how I conduct interviews, perhaps you should find another show to work on. The threat was clear and ugly. Susanna's face went pale, but she didn't back down. Perhaps I should, she said quietly. Because I don't want to be associated with this kind of journalism, if you can even call it that. This isn't holding people accountable or asking tough questions. This is using your platform to attack women and then acting surprised when they defend themselves. Dame Judi had reached for her microphone and was removing it carefully, her movements deliberate and final. Every eye in the studio was on her as she placed the microphone on the chair and picked up her handbag. "Where do you think you're going?" Piers demanded, his voice sharp. "You don't just walk off an interview because you don't like the questions." Dame Judi turned to face him one final time, and her expression was one of absolute contempt. "Watch me," she said simply. "You invited me here under false pretenses. You ambushed me with topics we never agreed to discuss. You've been disrespectful, aggressive, and completely unprofessional. You've shown no interest in an actual conversation, only in trying to score points and create controversy. I have no obligation to sit here and be part of your circus. And I certainly have no obligation to help you attack other women for having the courage to speak up about abuse." Piers took a step toward her, his face twisted with anger. "You're making a huge mistake. You're going to look like you can't handle tough questions, like you're too fragile to engage with different viewpoints." "No, Piers," Dame Judi said, her voice calm and clear. "What I'm going to look like is someone who refused to participate in a hit job disguised as journalism. What I'm going to look like is someone who stood up for women instead of tearing them down for your entertainment. What I'm going to look like is someone who knows the difference between a tough interview and a hostile ambush. And I'm entirely comfortable with all of that." She turned to Susanna with a warm smile. "Susanna, you're a true professional, and I'm sorry you have to work in these conditions. Thank you for trying to make this bearable." Susanna's eyes filled with tears. "Dame Judi, I'm so sorry about all of this. You deserved so much better." Dame Judi reached out and squeezed Susanna's hand gently. "Don't apologize for someone else's behavior, dear. You've been nothing but kind and professional throughout this ordeal." Then she turned to address the main camera directly, her voice carrying that distinctive authority that had commanded attention on stages and screens for 6 decades. "To anyone watching this at home, particularly young women, I want you to know something important. When someone tries to bully you into silence, when someone questions your experiences or dismisses your pain, when someone demands you provide proof of abuse that may be impossible to provide, when someone suggests that speaking up makes you weak or attention-seeking, you have every right to walk away. You have every right to refuse to participate in conversations designed to demean you. You have every right to stand up for yourself and for other women. Don't let anyone convince you that staying silent is strength. Real strength is using your voice, even when, especially when, it's difficult to do so." The studio audience rose to their feet as one, the applause deafening and sustained. Many people were crying, moved by her words and her dignified refusal to be cowed by Piers's aggression. Dame Judi gave them a small wave, her trademark grace reasserting itself, and then she walked toward the studio exit with her head held high. As she reached the edge of the set, she paused and looked back, not at Piers, but at Susanna. "Take care of yourself, Susanna. You deserve better than this." And then Dame Judi Dench, at 90 years old, walked off a live television set in the middle of an interview for the first time in her entire career, leaving behind a studio in chaos, an audience in uproar, and a host whose face had gone from angry red to shocked white as he realized what had just happened. Piers stood motionless for several long seconds, clearly trying to process the situation and figure out how to spin it to his advantage. When he finally spoke, his voice was defensive and aggressive in equal measure. "Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. A perfect example of what happens when you dare to ask questions that challenge the accepted narrative. Rather than engage in actual debate, rather than defend her positions with logic and reason, we just saw a famous actress throw a tantrum and walk off because she didn't like being challenged." The audience's reaction was immediate and hostile. Boos and shouts of disagreement filled the studio, many people calling out things like "shame on you" and "she was right to leave." The sound seemed to rattle Piers, his eyes darting around the studio as he realized that he had lost not just his guest but the entire room. Susanna's voice was quiet but carried clearly through her microphone. "That's not what happened, and you know it, Piers. What we just saw was a respected actress being ambushed with topics she was never told we would discuss, being attacked for defending women's right to speak up about abuse, and finally choosing to remove herself from a situation that had become completely untenable. If anyone should be ashamed right now, it's us for allowing this to happen on our show." Piers turned on her, his anger boiling over completely now. "Allowing this to happen. I conducted a proper interview, asked real questions, refused to engage in the usual softball nonsense. If Dame Judi Dench couldn't handle that, if she's so fragile that she needs to run away the moment someone challenges her views, then maybe she shouldn't be doing interviews at all." The word fragile seemed to be the final straw for Susanna. She stood up from the desk, her movements sharp and decisive. "Fragile. She's 90 years old, Piers. She's had a career spanning 6 decades. She's performed in some of the most challenging roles in theater and film history. She's faced critics, skeptics, and difficult situations countless times. And she just articulated her position with more clarity, passion, and intelligence than I've heard from you in years. She didn't run away because she was fragile. She walked away because she has enough self-respect to refuse to be part of your personal crusade against women who speak up about abuse. Before we see how this situation completely implodes, make sure you're still with Modern Stories by hitting that like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? This is the kind of real, unfiltered content you won't find anywhere else. Now let's see what happens next. Piers's mouth opened and closed, clearly shocked that Susanna had not only contradicted him, but done so forcefully and publicly. "You need to calm down," he said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that made several crew members wince. "You're being overly emotional about this as usual." "Overly emotional," Susanna repeated, her voice shaking now, not with distress but with fury. "That's your response? That's what you say when a woman disagrees with you? She's being overly emotional. Do you have any idea how insulting that is? How dismissive? How perfectly it proves every point Dame Judi just made about how you actually view women." The control room was in absolute chaos. Producers were shouting contradictory instructions, some wanting to cut to commercial immediately, others arguing they needed to let this play out because cutting away would only make things worse. The director had given up trying to control the situation and was simply letting the cameras roll, capturing every moment of what was rapidly becoming the most infamous broadcast in Good Morning Britain's history. Piers seemed to be struggling to regain any semblance of control. He looked directly at the main camera, his expression attempting confidence, but achieving only desperation. What you're seeing here, viewers, is exactly the problem with modern discourse. Two women, one old enough to know better, one young enough that perhaps there's still hope, completely unable to handle a robust discussion about important issues. This is what happens when feelings are prioritized over facts, when emotion trumps reason, when "Stop!" Susanna's voice cut through his monologue like a knife. "Just stop, Piers. Stop trying to spin this as some kind of victory for you, or some kind of failure for women who dare to disagree with you. Everyone watching saw what really happened here. You ambushed a guest with topics she wasn't prepared to discuss. You attacked an entire movement of women speaking up about abuse. You dismissed their experiences as hysteria and attention-seeking. You showed more concern for hypothetical false accusations than for documented widespread harassment and assault. And when you were called out on all of it, when Dame Judi articulated exactly why your position is harmful and wrong, you accused her of being fragile and throwing a tantrum. That's not journalism, Piers. That's not even entertainment. That's just cruelty." The studio audience erupted in applause again, even louder than before. Several people were standing and cheering for Susanna, clearly thrilled to see someone finally standing up to Piers on his own show. His face had gone through so many color changes that he looked genuinely unwell. Purple and red and white, all fighting for dominance. "Fine. he said, his voice tight and clipped. If that's how you feel, Susanna, if you're so disgusted by this show and by me, then perhaps you should follow Dame Judy's example and walk off. Perhaps you should go find a show where everyone agrees with each other and no one ever asks difficult questions. Perhaps you should. The director's voice suddenly came through loud and clear in their earpieces, audible enough that the microphones picked it up. We're cutting to commercial. Now, Piers, Susanna, we're going to break. Stand by, but Susanna wasn't standing by. She was already removing her microphone, her hands shaking slightly, but her movements determined. You know what, Piers? That's exactly what I'm going to do. I have sat beside you for years, tried to moderate your worst impulses, attempted to bring some balance and decency to this desk. But what you did today, how you treated Dame Judy, it's crossed a line I can't come back from. I'm done. The words seemed to echo through the studio. Crew members stood frozen, watching history unfold in real time. Piers's expressions cycled rapidly through shock, anger, and something that might have been panic. You can't be serious, he said, his voice lacking its usual certainty. You're going to walk off over this? Over me asking legitimate questions? Over me refusing to bow down to the politically correct mob? Susanna placed her microphone on the desk with deliberate care. It's not about political correctness, Piers. It's never been about that. It's about basic human decency. It's about treating people, especially guests who come here in good faith, with respect. It's about not using your platform to attack vulnerable people or to undermine movements that are genuinely helping victims of abuse. And it's about recognizing when you've gone too far, which is something you seem completely incapable of doing. She picked up her notes in her handbag, her movements calm despite the chaos surrounding her. I'm sorry to everyone who works on this show, she said, addressing the crew directly. You're all wonderful people who deserve better than this, but I can't be part of it anymore. As Susanna walked off the set to thunderous applause from the studio audience, Piers stood alone at the desk, surrounded by empty chairs and the wreckage of what had been, until an hour ago, one of Britain's most watched morning shows. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every moment of his isolation, his face a mixture of defiance and something that looked almost like fear. The director's voice came through again. Piers, we need you to do something. Say something, anything. We're still live. Piers looked directly into the camera, and for perhaps the first time in his career, he seemed genuinely at a loss for words. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual, missing its characteristic confidence. Well, he began, then stopped, seeming to search for what to say next. That was certainly unexpected. It seems we've lost both our guest and my co-host in the span of about 10 minutes, which I believe might be some kind of record. He attempted a laugh, but it came out hollow and forced. Before things get even worse for Piers Morgan, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button for Modern Stories if you want to see more incredible confrontations and viral moments like this. We're not done yet. There's still more fallout to come. Piers seemed to be trying to find his footing, to reconstruct some version of events that would cast him in a better light. Look, he continued, his voice gaining a bit of strength. I understand that what you've just witnessed might seem controversial to some people. But this is what happens when you refuse to engage in groupthink, when you ask the questions that others are afraid to ask, when you challenge the prevailing narratives. Sometimes people can't handle that. Sometimes they walk away, rather than defending their positions with actual arguments and evidence. The spin was classic Piers Morgan, attempting to reframe his own behavior as brave truth-telling and everyone else's reactions as weakness or inability to handle debate. But the studio audience wasn't buying it. Several people shouted disagreements, others shook their heads in obvious disgust, and a few had already gotten up and left, unwilling to be part of the audience for this disaster any longer. The senior producer appeared on set, something that almost never happened during a live broadcast, walking directly to Piers with an expression that mixed concern and barely controlled anger. The cameras caught every moment as the producer leaned in and spoke quietly but urgently to Piers, gesturing toward the exit. Piers's face went pale as he listened, then flushed red again, then pale once more. He shook his head repeatedly, clearly arguing, but the producer's expression remained firm. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, Piers straightened up and addressed the cameras one more time. "It appears," he said, his voice tight, "that the powers that be have decided we should end this segment here. We'll be taking a break, and when we return, we'll have—" He paused, seeming to realize he had no idea what they would have since both his planned guest and his co-host were gone. Different programming. He stood up from the desk without another word and walked off set, his posture stiff and defensive, leaving behind a studio in complete disarray. The moment the cameras cut, the studio erupted into chaos. Crew members were talking over each other, some on phones with network executives, others clustered in groups discussing what they had just witnessed. The audience was buzzing with conversation, many people pulling out their phones to text or tweet about what they had seen, already knowing this would be national news within minutes. In the green room, Dame Judi sat calmly, having watched the rest of the interviews collapse on a monitor. A production assistant approached her hesitantly. "Dame Judi, I'm so sorry about what happened out there. That was completely unacceptable. You were never supposed to be ambushed like that." "Dame." Judi looked up with a gentle smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I suspected something was off when I saw how Piers was preparing," she said quietly. "But I honestly didn't think he would go that far." The assistant shifted uncomfortably. "For what it's worth, everyone on the crew is on your side. What he did was wrong, and the way you handled it was—" The assistant paused, searching for the right word. "Magnificent." Susanna Reid arrived in the green room a few moments later, still visibly shaken but with her head held high. Dame Judi stood to greet her, and the two women embraced. "I'm so sorry you had to experience that," Susanna said, her voice thick with emotion. "I tried to stop it, tried to redirect, but he was determined." "You have nothing to apologize for," Dame Judi replied warmly. "You were wonderful, Susanna. The way you stood up to him, the way you articulated exactly what was wrong with his behavior, that took real courage." Susanna wiped at her eyes. "I just couldn't sit there anymore and be complicit in that kind of treatment. I've made excuses for him before, tried to balance out his worst impulses, but today he crossed every line." Dame Judi squeezed her hand gently. "You did the right thing. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is refuse to participate in something we know is wrong, even when it costs us personally." Within an hour, the footage had exploded across every social media platform. The hashtag Dame Judi Walkout was trending #1 on Twitter worldwide. News outlets across Britain and internationally were running the story as breaking news. Mental health organizations and women's advocacy groups were releasing statements praising Dame Judi for her defense of abuse survivors and condemning Piers' treatment of both the Me Too movement and his guest. Celebrities from across the entertainment industry were tweeting their support for Dame Judi and Susanna, with many sharing their own experiences of media hostility when discussing harassment or abuse. The backlash against Piers was swift, comprehensive, and devastating. Sponsors began pulling their advertisements from Good Morning Britain within hours. Ofcom announced they had received over 40,000 complaints about the broadcast, one of the highest numbers in the regulator's history. The ITV switchboard was overwhelmed with calls from viewers expressing outrage. Even some of Piers' usual defenders found themselves unable or unwilling to support his behavior this time, with several conservative commentators writing columns suggesting he had finally gone too far. By that evening, ITV released a carefully worded statement expressing deep regret over the interview, acknowledging that Dame Judi had been subjected to an inappropriate line of questioning that deviated significantly from the agreed-upon topics, and confirming they were conducting an immediate review of their editorial practices. The statement conspicuously did not defend or support Piers' conduct. Dame Judi's publicist released a brief statement on her behalf that was characteristically gracious but firm. Dame Judi agreed to appear on Good Morning Britain to discuss her documentary about theatre education, a cause she is deeply passionate about. Instead, she was subjected to an ambush interview on topics she was never told would be discussed. She stood up for abuse survivors and for basic standards of journalistic integrity. She has nothing to add to what she already said on camera and hopes the focus can return to the important work of supporting young people's access to the arts. The next morning, Piers Morgan released a lengthy statement on social media that many read as equal parts defiant and defensive. He insisted he had done nothing wrong, that he had simply asked important questions that needed to be asked, that Dame Judi had overreacted to legitimate scrutiny, and that the outrage was simply another example of cancel culture run amok. But the statement was met with overwhelming criticism, with many pointing out that it contained not a single word of apology or acknowledgement that perhaps his approach had been problematic. Over the following days, pressure mounted on ITV to take action. Several advertisers announced they would not return to the program, while Piers remained host. Viewing figures had initially spiked with curiosity about the aftermath, but then plummeted as many regular viewers expressed disgust at what had happened. Other ITV presenters began quietly distancing themselves from Piers, with some going so far as to express public support for Dame Judi and Susanna. 2 weeks after the incident, ITV made the announcement that media observers had been predicting since the day of the confrontation. Piers Morgan and Good Morning Britain would be parting ways by mutual agreement. The official statement spoke of different visions for the program's future and thanked Piers for his years of service while wishing him well in future endeavors. Piers's own statement was characteristically combative, claiming he had been forced out for refusing to apologize for his beliefs and vowing to continue speaking his mind on whatever platform would have him. The contrast between the two statements, ITV's measured professionalism and Piers's aggrieved defiance, seemed to many observers to perfectly encapsulate exactly what had gone wrong. In the weeks and months that followed, Dame Judi Dench rarely spoke about the incident, preferring to let her actions on that day speak for themselves. When asked about it during an interview several months later, she was characteristically thoughtful and generous. "I don't take any pleasure in what happened," she said. "I don't enjoy confrontation, and I certainly didn't go on that program looking for one. But there are moments when staying silent, when going along with something you know is wrong, that silence becomes complicity. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't sit there and let him use me to attack women who've had the courage to speak up about abuse. I couldn't let him suggest that their experiences were hysteria or attention-seeking. Too many women have suffered in silence for too long for me to be part of perpetuating that culture." The interviewer asked if she regretted anything about how she handled the situation. Dame Judi considered the question carefully. "I regret that it was necessary," she said finally. "I regret that we live in a world where some men with platforms seem more concerned with defending hypothetical false accusations than with addressing actual widespread abuse. I regret that speaking up for abuse survivors is seen as controversial rather than just basic human decency. But do I regret standing up for what I believe in? Do I regret refusing to be part of something I found morally objectionable? No, I don't regret that at all." As for Susanna Reid, she too moved on to new opportunities, her decision to walk off the set having elevated her in many people's eyes, from someone complicit in Piers's behavior to someone willing to take a stand when it mattered most. In interviews, she spoke candidly about the difficulty of the decision, but the certainty she felt that it was the right one. "I'd tried for so long to be a moderating influence," she explained. "I thought I could balance out his more extreme positions, that my presence would help ensure some guests weren't subjected to his worst behavior. But that morning with Dame Judi, I realized I wasn't moderating anything. I was just providing cover. I was allowing ITV to claim the show was balanced, when really what I was doing was enabling behavior I found unconscionable. Walking off wasn't an easy decision, but it was the only one I could live with." The incident became a touchstone in discussions about media responsibility, about how interviews should be conducted, about the treatment of women who speak up about abuse, and about when staying in a situation crosses the line from trying to improve it from within to simply being complicit in harm. Media ethics courses use the footage as a case study in how not to conduct an interview. Women's advocacy groups reference Dame Judy's words about strength and silence in their materials. Young journalists studied both the interview itself and the aftermath as lessons in what happens when personal agendas override journalistic integrity. Piers Morgan eventually found other platforms for his commentary, though he never quite recovered the mainstream prominence he had enjoyed before that March morning. He continued to insist he had done nothing wrong, that he had been cancelled for speaking unpopular truths, that the real story was about the suppression of free speech rather than the abuse of a powerful platform. But most people who had watched the incident came away with a very different understanding of what had actually happened. Make sure you're subscribed to Modern Stories because we're bringing you the conclusion to this incredible story, and you won't want to miss the final impact this confrontation had on everyone involved. Hit that subscribe button and let's finish this. Years later, when the dust had settled and emotions had cooled, a television documentary examining the incident interviewed people who had been involved or affected by it. Dame Judi participated, as did Susanna, along with media experts, women's advocates, and even some crew members who had been in the studio that day. The picture that emerged was of a moment that had been building for a long time. A confrontation that was perhaps inevitable given Piers's increasingly hostile commentary about women who spoke up about abuse and his specific obsession with attacking the Me Too movement. Dame Judi, when you walked into that studio that morning, did you have any sense of what was coming? The interviewer asked. Dame Judi smiled slightly. Not the specifics, no. But I think perhaps at some level I suspected Piers had an agenda beyond discussing theater education. There was something about the way the booking had been handled, some evasiveness about exactly what would be discussed, that felt slightly off. But I gave him the benefit of the doubt. I assumed our years of acquaintance, if not quite friendship, would mean he would treat me with basic respect. I was wrong about that. The documentary included footage of media analysts discussing the broader implications of the incident. This was a watershed moment in several respects. One expert explained, it exposed the hollowness of the claim that aggressive, confrontational interviewing is just asking tough questions. What Piers Morgan did that day wasn't tough questioning. It was a calculated attempt to use a respected figure to validate his personal agenda. And when she refused to be used that way, when she articulated exactly why his position was harmful, he completely fell apart. He tried to bully her into submission, tried to play the victim when that didn't work, and ultimately was left looking exactly as Dame Judi had described him, someone more interested in scoring points than in seeking truth or showing basic human compassion. Another analyst added context about the impact on discussions of abuse and harassment. What Dame Judi did that morning was give voice to something millions of women felt but struggled to articulate. The frustration of being told they were being hysterical when they spoke about their experiences. The exhaustion of having to justify why abuse should be taken seriously. The anger at watching men with platforms spend more energy defending hypothetical false accusations than addressing actual, documented, widespread abuse. She said all of that clearly, forcefully, and with the authority of someone who had lived through decades of the very culture she was describing. And she did it while maintaining her dignity, even in the face of aggressive hostility. That's powerful, and it's why the moment resonated so deeply with so many people. The documentary also examined the impact on Susanna Reid's career and reputation. Walking off that show was career suicide, one segment began, showing footage of the immediate aftermath and the speculation about whether Susanna would ever work in television again. But within weeks it became clear that Susanna Reid had read the cultural moment perfectly. Far from ending her career, her decision to stand with Dame Judi elevated her standing tremendously. She received offers from multiple networks, all eager to work with someone who had demonstrated such clear principles. She became a sought-after commentator on media ethics and women's issues in journalism. And perhaps most importantly, She became a role model for other journalists who felt trapped in situations where they were expected to be complicit in behavior they found problematic. Susanna herself, interviewed for the documentary, reflected on the long-term impact of that decision. At the time, I was terrified, she admitted. I thought I might never work again. I thought people would say I was being oversensitive or unprofessional, or that I should have just kept quiet and done my job. But the response was overwhelming and humbling. Thousands of people reached out to say they had been in similar situations, where they had to choose between their principles and their livelihoods. And seeing someone make the choice I made gave them courage to do the same. That's not something I ever expected, but it's something I'm grateful for. The documentary included interviews with survivors of abuse who spoke about what Dame Judi's words had meant to them. Hearing her talk about how speaking up isn't weakness but strength, one woman said, tears in her eyes, that gave me the courage to finally report what had happened to me. I'd been silent for 5 years, telling myself I was being strong by just getting on with things. But hearing Dame Judi, someone I'd always admired, say that speaking up is braver than staying silent, that changed something in me. Another survivor spoke about the impact of seeing someone famous defend the Me Too movement so forcefully. I'd heard so much about false accusations, about how women were ruining men's lives, about how we should all just move on. It made me feel like maybe my experience didn't matter. Like maybe I was wrong to still be angry about what happened to me. But Dame Judi, standing up to Piers Morgan, refusing to let him dismiss abuse survivors as hysterical or attention-seeking, it validated something I needed validated. It reminded me that my experience mattered, that abuse is serious regardless of who the abuser is or how powerful they are, and that speaking about it isn't weakness. It's necessary. The footage of the confrontation itself, replayed in the documentary, remained as powerful years later as it had been when it first aired. Watching Dame Judi's face as she realized she had been ambushed, seeing her decision to fight back rather than retreat, hearing her articulate so clearly why Piers's position was harmful, witnessing her dignified exit when it became clear no productive conversation was possible. All of it still carried tremendous emotional weight. The documentary's narrator noted that the clip had been viewed over 200 million times across various platforms, making it one of the most watched moments in television history. But more than just being watched, it had been discussed, analyzed, referenced, and used as a teaching tool in contexts ranging from journalism schools to therapy sessions to corporate training about workplace behavior. One media professor, interviewed for the documentary, explained the incident's lasting significance. What makes this moment so important isn't just that it was dramatic or that it involved famous people. It's that it crystallized so clearly the tensions that exist around discussions of abuse, power, and gender. On one side, you had Piers Morgan representing a certain type of thinking, the idea that false accusations are the real crisis, that women who speak up are probably lying or exaggerating, that men in power are the real victims of movements like Me Too. On the other side, you had Dame Judi Dench representing reality, the documented truth that abuse is widespread, that most accusations are true, that the real crisis is not false accusations, but the epidemic of genuine abuse that has gone unaddressed for generations. And watching that conflict play out in real time, watching Dame Judi refuse to back down or be intimidated, watching her walk away rather than be complicit in attacking abuse survivors, that was clarifying for millions of people. The documentary concluded with recent footage of Dame Judi at a theater event, surrounded by young actors and actresses who had clearly grown up admiring her. One young woman worked up the courage to approach and thank Dame Judi for what she had done that day on Good Morning Britain. Your willingness to stand up for us, to defend survivors, to refuse to be part of tearing down women who speak up, that meant everything to me and to so many others. Dame Judi's smile was warm and genuine. That's very kind of you to say, but I only did what any decent person should do. The principle isn't complicated. When people speak about abuse, we should believe them and support them rather than immediately doubting them and attacking their credibility. When movements arise to address systemic problems, we should engage with them seriously rather than dismissing them as hysteria. And when someone with a platform uses it to attack vulnerable people, we should refuse to be part of it. These aren't radical positions. They're just basic human decency. The final shot of the documentary returned to that moment from years earlier. Dame Judi Dench walking off the Good Morning Britain set with her head held high. The studio audience on their feet applauding, Susanna Reid about to follow her example, and Piers Morgan standing alone at his desk, surrounded by empty chairs and the consequences of his own behavior. The narrator's voice came over the image. In the end, what happened that March morning was simple but profound. A woman with decades of experience, wisdom, and moral clarity refused to be used as a weapon against other women. She refused to let a man with a personal agenda put words in her mouth or use her reputation to validate his attacks on abuse survivors. She spoke truth to power, maintained her dignity in the face of hostility, and walked away rather than be complicit in something she found morally wrong. And in doing so, Dame Judi Dench reminded millions of people that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply refuse to participate in cruelty, regardless of the cost. That's not just good television. It's a masterclass in integrity. The screen faded to black with text appearing. Dame Judi Dench continues to act, advocate for theater education, and support survivors of abuse. Susanna Reid went on to host several successful programs and remains an outspoken advocate for ethical journalism. Piers Morgan continues to work in media, though his platforms and influence have diminished significantly since 2025. The footage of this confrontation remains one of the most viewed and discussed moments in television history, a reminder that sometimes the most important thing we can do is stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Years later, in a quiet moment away from cameras and public attention, someone asked Dame Judi if she ever regretted how things had unfolded that morning. If she wished she had handled it differently, perhaps stayed and tried to have a calmer discussion, found a way to avoid the confrontation altogether. Dame Judi was quiet for a moment before responding. "No," she said simply. "Some things are worth fighting for. Some principles are worth defending. And some behaviors are worth walking away from, rather than endorsing with your presence. I stood up for abuse survivors that day. I refused to let my reputation be used to attack women who had the courage to speak about their experiences. I maintained my dignity in the face of hostility. And I walked away rather than be part of something I found morally wrong. I'm proud of all of that. I wouldn't change a thing." And that, perhaps more than anything else, was why the moment had resonated so powerfully and continued to do so years later. In a world that often felt confusing and morally ambiguous, where right and wrong could seem impossible to distinguish, Dame Judi Dench had provided absolute clarity. She had shown that standing up for what's right doesn't require aggression or cruelty. It requires conviction, compassion, and the courage to walk away when staying would mean compromising your principles. She had demonstrated that real strength isn't found in bullying others or using your platform to attack vulnerable people. It's found in defending those who need defending, even when it costs you personally. And she had proven that sometimes the most powerful response to hostility isn't to fight fire with fire, it's to simply refuse to participate, to maintain your dignity, to speak your truth, and to walk away with your integrity intact. That was the real story of what happened that March morning in 2025, and it was a story that would continue to inspire and influence long after everyone involved had moved on to whatever came next. The moment itself had passed, but its impact, its meaning, its reminder of what integrity looks like in action, that would endure. If you made it to the end of this incredible story, you're exactly the kind of viewer Modern Stories needs. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, smash that like button, and let me know in the comments what you thought about Dame Judi Dench's stand against Piers Morgan. Was she right to walk off? Should Susanna have followed her? What do you think about how Piers handled the whole situation? Drop your thoughts below, and I'll see you in the next story, where we'll bring you another unforgettable confrontation that had everyone talking. Until then, Remember what Dame Judi showed us. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply refuse to be part of something wrong. Thanks for watching Modern Stories, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you for watching our channel, Modern Stories. If you liked our video, you should subscribe for more amazing videos like this. Have a healthy and happy day. See you in the next one.